A surprising feature of most of the recent teachers' strike wave is that it has mostly taken hold in Republican-dominated states where unions are institutionally weak and politically isolated. How could states that voted for someone as reactionary as Donald Trump also see teachers brazenly walking off the job, often in defiance of the law and their own union leadership, while pushing for a broad pro-public education and anti-austerity agenda, only 18 months later? Behind such puzzlement is the thinking that workers' ideas are what leads to their willingness to take militant workplace action. In this view, if a worker holds conservative political beliefs, say, they're a fundamentalist Christian, or support Trump's racist call to build the wall, they aren't likely to go on strike, but if they're more sympathetic to left-leaning views on economic policy and oppose openly bigoted statements, they will be more amenable to walking off the job. The teachers' strike wave scrambles this logic. How can we explain this discrepancy? I recently finished Martin Glaberman's Wartime Strikes, The Struggle Against the No-Strike Pledge in the UAW During World War II. The book recounts the battles within the United Auto Workers, UAW, the country's most important industrial union at the time, and the rest of the Congress of Industry. It also tells the story of the rank-and-file auto workers, members of the UAW as well as the Mechanics' Educational Society of America, MESA, and miners who walked off the job during the war in defiance of the pledge. At the time this no-strike pledge was instituted, the United States had just emerged from a period of remarkable worker militancy. General strikes swept through Minneapolis, San Francisco, and Toledo in 1934. The CIO made remarkable gains in building industrial unions, often through strikes and by pushing a broad vision of social unionism that fought for the entire working class. Workers demonstrated a remarkable willingness to walk off the job throughout the period, often battling the boss not just over bread and butter issues like wages but for control of the production process itself. Radical leftists from the Communist Party and various socialist groups played key roles in promoting militancy, playing frontline roles fighting brutal bosses and police. The workers' movement was ascendant, capitalists and politicians were terrified. Into this situation stepped a fledgling CIO bureaucracy. In exchange for key roles of influence and power in the Roosevelt administration and the establishment of legalized, bureaucratic collective bargaining, the new officialdom attempted to tamp down worker militancy. When the United States entered World War II, normalizing production for waging war became a top priority for FDR. CIO leaders loyally took the no-strike pledge to their unions, in many cases ramming the agreement down workers' throats, thinking they would receive a steady stream of wage increases and good benefits packages in return. The result, as recounted by historians like Nelson Lichtenstein in Labor's War at Home, the CIO in World War II, is that union leaders, including avowed socialists and communists, were safely integrated into the American political system. The wartime no-strike pledge was part of a broader transformation of U.S. unions that sapped organized labor's ultimate source of power, the ability of workers to withhold their labor. Not long after, the state and capital would go back on the attack against workers. With collective bargaining and even strikes routinized and labor leaders transitioning from shop floor militants to the new men of power, as C. Wright Mills called them in 1948, workers' power quickly eroded. Where do red state teachers fit in all of this? Glaberman describes how the factional fight over the no-strike pledge came to a head in 1945, when a poll went out among all auto workers over whether to maintain it. Only about a quarter of the membership bothered to vote, but of that quarter, an overwhelming majority, 72.6%, voted yes. This would seem to indicate widespread opposition to strikes as a matter of principle within the UAW. And yet at the exact moment the election took place, those same workers who abstained or voted no engaged in a massive strike wave, in brazen defiance of the no-strike pledge they voted to uphold, across the auto industry. Bureau of Labor Statistics data indicates that 388,763 workers, half of all auto workers in the country, went on to strike in this period. As Glaberman puts it, a majority of workers went out on strike in a period when a referendum was indicating close to 2-to-1 opposition to wartime strikes. Published in 1980, Wartime Strikes is still a worthwhile read for anyone looking to understand how the leadership of the dynamic, militant wing of the American labor movement quickly turned towards a timid form of bureaucratic business unionism. For today's labor militants, Glaberman's analysis of the discrepancy between auto workers' beliefs concerning the no-strike pledge and their actions in defying it is directly relevant to the teachers' strike wave. Here, we reproduce the concluding chapter of Wartime Strikes. The historical backdrop of wartime strikes and those that have taken place today are obviously different, and Glaberman's analysis of why auto workers took the actions they did can't be directly transposed onto today's events. His insistence that working people can be transformed when they're forced to deal with the reality in front of them is an essential reminder for anyone trying to understand where and how the next working class upsurge might continue to spread today. Micah Uetricht, it is rare for history to provide so clear-cut and well-documented a contradiction. On the one hand, a majority of auto workers voted to sustain the no-strike pledge. On the other hand, a majority of auto workers went out on wildcat strikes. It should be a fruitful source of analysis or understanding. But traditional social science cannot easily deal with this kind of contradiction. The facts strike a powerful blow against sociological surveys and academic views of consciousness. The UAW referendum was a pretty good version of a sociological survey, a simple statement of belief on a clearly stated subject. And yet, even while the survey was being made, the events belied the results of the survey. There had been some understanding that opinion surveys are static and their results cannot be projected too easily into the future. T. Lupton, for example, noted, "The interview is often useful as a means to ascertain attitudes, opinions, and beliefs, but it is not possible to proceed logically from statements about attitudes to descriptions of actual or probable behavior." Attitudes expressed in an interview may not affect the choice made. Many choices involve a clash between attitudes stated with equal conviction in the situation of the interview. But here is a situation in which they do not even have validity in the present and the recent past. Part of the contradiction is illuminated by the following. We tackled Jimmy on this apparent conflict of views, asking him why it was that he could support an act which intended to curb the use of union power while, in his own work situation, he advocated the greater use of that power. He then made it clear that he didn't think all strikes were a bad thing, because some do have a good foundation. You know, the workers have got reason to strike, but some I believe are communist-inspired, and so if the act can stop that sort of strike, then I'm all in favor of it. It becomes clear that it is not working class action that is being rejected, but working class action as it is projected by the mass media. Not militancy but mindless militancy. Jimmy and his mates are told that strikes are bad, that workers are led by communists, and they believe it. To an extent, that is. Certainly they believe it to the point of arguing it in a pub or of answering a public opinion pollster. But when it comes to daily activity at work, they know that strikes can be justified. Maybe they won't go on strike, but they won't decide not to strike because strikes are bad for the country, or because strikes are the results of agitators. Their decision to strike, or not, will be geared to their own particular situation. It is this tension between generally propagated abstract ideas and practical necessity which explains why, even at a time when wider and wider sections of the workforce were involved in strike action, public opinion polls continued to find so many workers who considered strikes a bad thing. One of the problems of academic social science is the difficulty it has in dealing with any kind of contradiction. Contradiction is viewed as a problem to be straightened out, to be interpreted away. On the other hand, a dialectical view of reality not only assumes contradiction as normal and natural, it views contradiction as the source of all development, change, and movement. It makes contradiction central to its concerns. The one major investigation into the effect of affluence upon the British working class, for example, begins with the assumption that the sort of understanding which workers have of their situation can be analysed in terms of its overarching consistency. Given this assumption, models of consciousness can be arrived at in which one set of ideas are seen to relate in a formal logical manner to others. The problem with this view of things is that it fails to root consciousness in the structure of the real world, where experience is more characterized by contradiction than consistency. One question that is raised by the no-strike pledge referendum is, who are the militants? It has long been the received wisdom of the left, and the right, as well, that the more militant workers are also more conscious, whatever that word means, and are therefore also the more active in union affairs. That is, militancy is defined as some combination of a radical point of view on particular questions and activism in the union. It is not too distant from the point of view of many leftists that abstention from the political process is a sign of backwardness. People who do not vote for Republicans or Democrats and yet cannot be enticed to vote for Marxist candidates are perceived as needing education. To put it crudely, conscious militancy is to some degree related to participation in the parliamentary system. In the UAW referendum, many workers, a substantial minority, voted to rescind the no-strike pledge. It seems reasonable to conclude, however, that the workers who did not vote at all exhibited a greater degree of militancy than those who did. First, of course, there is the fact that acting in a militant way, striking, in the face of considerable sanctions, demands more dedication and courage than simply expressing a point of view, especially in a secret ballot. But there is a more important element involved than that. It is not a matter of standing in judgment on workers, measuring their militancy on a scale of 10, or any similar nonsense. It is a matter of finding out why workers behave the way they do and what that indicates for the future. And in that context it is important to understand the significance of abstention from the vote. To many thousands of auto workers who wildcatted but did not vote in the referendum did not matter. At least it did not matter enough to exert a very minimum effort. But to say that it did not matter is quite ambiguous. I believe it is valid to surmise that it did not matter because to most workers the union structure, like the institutional structure of society generally, is an alien reality. Union leaders are seen as politicians. Union leaders, politicians, businessmen, intellectuals, are seen as them, as opposed to us. The kind of satisfactions workers can expect to receive from them tends to be marginal. Things may get a little better or a little worse, but the fundamental reality of life at work is not likely to change. The basic argument against this view is that the abstention of voters contributes to the powerlessness of those voters. This view, however, is both reformist and false. It is reformist because it argues that people should take seriously minor adjustments in the system. In the case in point, the adjustment involves the difference between contracts that have no strike pledges and a union leadership that is not likely to authorize many strikes and a more sweeping pledge that covers all exceptions. In one sense, of course, everything matters, every improvement, no matter how slight. But this sustains the idea that fundamental changes are simply an accumulation of trivial ones, and that all expenditures of energy are equally valid. The view is false both in unions and in the society generally, that power resides with voters in proportion to numbers of votes. It is interesting to note in passing that the rejection of the parliamentary process in the United States on a significant scale dates from the turn of the present century. After a quarter of a century of extraordinarily violent and revolutionary struggles on the part of workers, farmers, and others, struggles which were beaten down by military force, and after 2 successive defeats of William Jennings Bryan for the presidency, running on a populist program, there was a significant and continuing drop in the proportion of eligible Americans who took part in the electoral process. This reflects, it seems to me, a cynical but accurate estimate of the value of the electoral process to workers and poor people generally. It is inherently critical of this society, or, more narrowly, the unions. It is more revolutionary, actual or potential, than the urging of workers to get out and vote, no matter how valid the cause. Objectively, however, they interpret their actions in their own minds. Workers who reject the institutional framework and take action outside of that framework are expressing a revolutionary potential. To put the matter negatively, workers do not have sufficient loyalty to the institutions of this society, including their institutions, to prevent them from abandoning those institutions in a revolutionary situation. The vote in the UAW referendum indicates a contradiction between activism and activity, but it is a contradiction that is imposed from the outside and is not inherent in working-class activity. It is only a rigid and artificial definition of activism that produces the contradiction. However, at least among those who voted to retain the no-strike pledge, there was a real contradiction between a verbalized belief and activity. There were many workers in the UAW who thought the no-strike pledge a necessary thing and who, nevertheless, went on to strike. It is in this area that the most significant conclusions can be drawn. The first conclusion is that belief does not govern activity. Marx and Engels noted, the question is not what this or that proletarian, or even the whole of the proletariat at the moment, considers as its aim. The question is what the proletariat is, and what, consequent on that being, it will be compelled to do. Its aim and historical action is irrevocably and obviously demonstrated in its own life situation as well as in the whole organization of bourgeois society today. There is a contradiction between the workers' being and the workers' consciousness. It would be quite remarkable if this were not so in a capitalist society. If that was where the matter rested, with the control by the ruling class of all the significant means of education and communication, then this whole discussion would be meaningless because it wouldn't matter in the slightest what workers thought. But the domination over the production of ideas is never enough for those who rule, because the reality of workers' lives is in contradiction to the ideas that dominate the society. It is the contradiction between being and consciousness which produces change. The hostile and alienating nature of work in this society, in addition to all the institutions inside and outside the factory designed to sustain the discipline of work, forces workers to resist their daily reality, individually and collectively. The response to that resistance tends to expose the mythology of freedom and equality and continually transforms the consciousness of workers. This is especially true of workers who have not yet been socialized into the accepted and institutionalized forms of resistance, such as the union grievance procedure, government boards, and so on. It is likely that those sections of the working class who were relatively new to the factories, such as the Southerners and women, were least likely to accept the discipline of factory work and the discipline of the union. This is borne out by the complaints of spokesmen for the military and spokesmen for the union. Workers during World War II were generally aware of the class nature of the American government, its favored treatment of corporations, its oppression of workers through a myriad of institutions, price controls, wage controls, restrictions on job transfers, the draft, housing priorities, etc. To say that they were aware does not mean that they were able to express this awareness in these abstract, intellectual terms when they went on strike and when they saw others such as the miners and the Mesa members go on to strike. They could not help but feel the terrible pressure of management, union, government, and press, all of which denounced them as unpatriotic, subversive, red, and so on. Going on strike made it necessary to modify their views on other things. Being workers made it necessary for them to go on strike. The second conclusion is that activity modifies belief. What exists, in fact, is a continually developing contradiction between being and consciousness. They act upon each other. It would be nonsense to say that consciousness has no effect on activity, if only to delay or restrain activity. But activity continually emerges to assert itself as the overriding element in that combination. That this is borne out by the way that auto workers behaved during World War II does not make it new. Marx and Engels were aware of it a century earlier, both for the production on a mass scale of this communist consciousness, and for the success of the cause itself. The alteration of men on a mass scale is necessary, an alteration which can only take place in a practical movement. A revolution. This revolution is necessary, therefore, not only because the ruling class cannot be overthrown in any other way, but also because the class overthrowing it can only in a revolution succeed in ridding itself of all the muck of ages and become fitted to found society anew. They did not think of the working class as revolutionary, because they consider the proletarians as gods, or because they thought that workers could be convinced of socialism by revolutionary intellectuals. They assumed workers who were ground down by their life under capitalism. Accumulation of wealth at one pole is, therefore, at the same time accumulation of misery, agony of toil, slavery, ignorance, brutality, mental degradation, at the opposite pole. What can be said of auto workers, then? That they were forced continually to overcome their limitations, to do battle with their union leaders and their government despite their patriotism and their prejudices. There can be little question that if the total picture of national unity and the no-strike pledge had been presented to a democratic vote of the American working class, it would have been roundly defeated. But what was the meaning of these struggles? Weren't they, after all, simply narrow strikes over economics and working conditions? I think that to deal with this, it is necessary to go beyond the self-imposed limitations of traditional social science, to avoid the obscurantism of pure empiricism. The contradiction between being and consciousness has a corollary, the contradiction between objective and subjective reality. It is necessary to draw a third conclusion from the events of World War II, that events have to be understood objectively rather than simply in terms of subjective motivation. And workers say that they are treated in a discriminatory way and they need improved working conditions or increased wages, and that this does not contradict their desire that the United States win the war. That is an empirical fact. But if we limit ourselves to the perception of the participants, we make a mockery of the study of historical events. When thousands of workers are striking for a variety of ends, all of them rather local and narrow, the accumulation of strikes makes for a qualitative change in the objective reality. Objectively, it is a threat to the existing social structure, no matter what the participants believe. And if the government and other major institutions respond on that level, then continuation and escalation of the strikes reinforces that threat. Taking into account the tendency toward exaggeration in political rhetoric, the attacks upon the working class by corporate executives, congressmen, and senators, and the executive branch of the government, clearly posed an awareness of a subversive threat. This was buttressed by the introduction and passage of anti-labor legislation and anti-subversive legislation. Was this simply a way of using the war to weaken unions? Enriched by the hindsight of the post-Watergate exposures, it would be dangerous to conclude that that was all that was involved. At least in terms of the narrow concern of defending their own society and their own rule, at least some of the fears of working-class activity must have been rooted in an accurate perception of where working-class wildcats could lead. It is a strange and unfortunate reality that revolutionaries have historically had less confidence in the revolutionary capacity of the working class than have had the rulers of capitalist society. In any case, the firings, the use of the draft against militants, arrests, and harassments were directed not against what workers thought but at what workers did. And, in turn, what workers thought was changed by what those in power did. Wildcat strikes were, in fact, political strikes because they were directed against the government. The government, through military and other personnel, made sure to make that clear. In the end, not very much seemed to be changed. There were massive legal strikes at the end of the war. The unions emerged from the war infinitely more bureaucratized than they were at the beginning. The UAW moved rather quickly to end the factional divisions and turn power over to the one-party machine of Walter Reuther. The power of the workers within the union structure continued to erode. American capitalism did not seem very threatened as it moved into the Cold War. However, it seems to me necessary to draw as much as possible, rather than as little as possible, out of the struggle over the no-strike pledge. As was noted earlier, such well-documented contradictions are rare enough in history. The narrower the interpretation, the more likely it is to be locked within the framework of acceptance of the status quo as an overriding given. At the very least, certain negative conclusions can be drawn. The revolutionary potential of the working class is not limited by day-to-day level of activity or by the superficial consciousness of workers, singly or in groups. Workers often act in contradiction to their own statements of belief. Expressions of satisfaction with life, they are rare enough. Patriotism, hostility to radicalism of a formal sort are totally useless in determining the future direction of American working-class activity. The contradiction between being and consciousness is what produces change, but it is change that tends to be sudden, explosive, and spontaneous. There is no indication that I am aware of that 30 years later American workers have resolved their contradictions and have lost their revolutionary potential. If anything, the hostility to work, to politics, to government,